February 12th, 1974, 25 minutes.
To those who would bear the hopes and future of our people, let the voice of their guns express the words of freedom. Greetings to the people and fellow comrade brothers and sisters. My name is Sin Q, and to my comrades I am known as Sin. I am a black man and a representative of black people. I hold the rank of General Field Marshal in the United Federated Forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Today I have received an order from the Symbionese War Council, the Court of the People, to the effect that I am ordered to convey the following message in behalf of the SLA and to insert a taped word of comfort and verification that Patricia Campbell Hearst is alive and safe.
On January 17, 1969, a shootout erupted on the campus of UCLA between members of the far-left Black Panther Party and Ron Karenga's Black Nationalist U.S. organization. UCLA's Black Student Union had just held an election to choose its leader for that year, and Karenga's preferred candidate lost, causing tensions with the Black Panthers to boil over. It isn't known for sure what events immediately precipitated the shootout or who fired first, but the aftermath left Panthers John Huggins and Bunchy Carter dead, while those on the U.S. organization side either disappeared permanently or served substantial prison terms. The shootout was the culmination of months of tension between U.S. and the Panthers, which was followed by a period of heightened violence, during which a pipe bomb would destroy the San Diego office of U.S. Org, and 4 more Black Panthers were assassinated. But what no one involved in the shootout realized at the time was that much of those rising tensions between the groups over the preceding months had been a direct result of an FBI COINTELPRO campaign intended to pit black activist groups against one another. Leading up to the shootout, the Bureau had created political cartoons mocking the Panthers and distributed them under the U.S. organization name, and sent a letter to U.S. Org containing fake plans for an assassination attempt on their leader, Ron Karenga, by the Panthers. FBI memos written shortly after the UCLA shooting show the Bureau happily taking credit for the violence and planning to provoke more. Quote, shootings, beatings, and a high degree of unrest continues to prevail in the ghetto area of southeast San Diego. Although no specific counterintelligence action can be credited with contributing to this overall situation, it is felt that a substantial amount of the unrest is directly attributable to this program. The Los Angeles division is aware of the mutually hostile feelings harbored between the organizations, and the first opportunity to capitalize on the situation will be maximized. It is intended that US Inc. will be appropriately and discreetly advised of the time and location of Black Panther activities in order that the two organizations might be brought together and thus grant nature the opportunity to take her due course. That the FBI provoked the shootout at UCLA is, at this point, beyond dispute, but there was another case of American intelligence agencies fomenting domestic left-wing violence that has remained largely unknown, even though it resulted in far more destruction and loss of life than the Panthers' U.S. rivalry. What if I told you there was a left-wing radical cult group created by a CIA operative fresh off of running the CIA's Phoenix program in Vietnam, who appointed as its leader a career police informant who didn't know or care much about politics, and the group's actions were so needlessly violent and ideologically incoherent that other left-wing revolutionaries openly accused them of being feds and agents provocateurs? The Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA for short, led by the General Field Marshal Symbionese, aka Donald DeFreeze, popped up out of nowhere in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1973 with an inscrutable ideology and a murky past, seemingly eager to commit the kinds of violence that their contemporaries in the movement had all but abandoned. But once they had gained international infamy for their abduction of the newspaper heiress Patty Hearst, investigators began unearthing uncomfortable facts about the SLA that made them look less like revolutionaries and more like patsies. It started to seem like the SLA may have been an experiment in counterintelligence that got out of hand, and that Donald DeFreeze wasn't the far-left guerrilla the government made him out to be. So how did a bumbling ex-con, whose only prior political activity was as a police informant trying to entrap Black Panthers into felony charges, transform into the radical insurgent General Field Marshal of the Symbionese Liberation Army? How did Donald DeFreeze, who was so ambivalent about his status as a revolutionary leader that he occasionally mistakenly referred to his own group as the Lebanese Liberation Army, inspire such loyalty in his cadre that they'd follow him to the grave? And if Donald DeFreeze wasn't responsible for the death and destruction the SLA left in its wake, then who was? The research for this video has been sourced from the book Revolution's End by Brad Schreiber, unless otherwise stated. The first pieces of the SLA puzzle came together well before the establishment of the group itself, when Donald DeFreeze was just a petty criminal operating on both coasts of the United States. Despite a long rap sheet, DeFreeze had an incredible ability to avoid prison time, even on serious charges. In the course of just 5 years, from 1964 to 1969, DeFreeze accrued no less than 7 separate arrests for possessing guns or explosives, almost all of them stolen, plus an attempted bank robbery, a motorcycle theft, and a failed gun store burglary, receiving probation each time. Although it's not known for sure when his informant work began, it couldn't have been any later than 1967, because in December of that year, DeFreeze would be arrested after a violent incident with a prostitute in Los Angeles, when he was found to be in possession of 12 handguns that had been stolen in a military surplus store robbery that netted over 200 firearms. DeFreeze would lead police to the man who had supplied him with the guns. In return, DeFreeze walked with a sentence of 5 years probation, and the LAPD even let him keep some of the pistols from the robbery. But DeFreeze didn't get away unscathed, as this plea deal seems to have been the precipitating event that kicked off his career as a prolific informant for the LAPD's version of COINTELPRO, run out of their infamous criminal conspiracy section and the criminal investigation and identification unit, where DeFreeze had handlers who weren't exactly subtle about the kinds of missions they'd send him on. Perhaps the most transparent setup of DeFreeze's informant career took place in 1969, when he was temporarily back on the East Coast in Newark, New Jersey, as recounted in the book Revolution's End by Brad Schreiber. On May 9, 1969, DeFreeze was involved in the most convoluted of his crimes up to that point. Because DeFreeze had lived in New Jersey, whether by California Attorney General Evel Younger directly or by a member of the California Criminal Investigation and Identification Unit in Sacramento, he was assigned to attempt to set up for arrest Ralph Cobb, an influential Black Panther in the Jersey City chapter. In Newark, Alfred Whiters, 32, custodian of the Temple B'nai Abraham, told local police that 2 black men, later identified as DeFreeze and Cobb, 20, of Jersey City, abducted him on a rainy morning and drove Whiters around in his own car for an hour with a shotgun held to his head. Whiters said they demanded the phone number of Joachim Prinz, the temple's nationally renowned rabbi, in order to extort from him $5,000, to then be used to free a Black Panther brother in jail, referred to only as the Enforcer. Whiters gave DeFreeze and Cobb the number to the temple's answering service, and they left him. No one could explain why his abductors didn't directly confront the rabbi, who was listed in the area phone book and lived in Orange, New Jersey. A week after Cobb was arrested, the temple was seriously damaged by fire. Rabbi Prinz publicly stated that he assumed the Black Panthers were responsible, although no one ever claimed credit for the arson. On May 28, Whiters was again questioned by the police, and under pressure, Whiters identified Cobb's accomplice via mugshot as Donald DeFreeze. Both Cobb and DeFreeze were investigated for assault, extortion, and the kidnapping of Whiters, but Cobb was released without an indictment. According to a story in New York Magazine, Essex County Prosecutor Hugh Francis told New York attorney Milton Friedman, who defended Cobb and the New Jersey Black Panther Party, that the case should never have come to the court. There was a plethora of inconsistencies and unanswered questions that Francis noted to New York Magazine. To begin with, Whiters' grand jury testimony was confusing. He also contradicted his own statements at times and suspiciously refused to take a lie detector test. Francis and Friedman recognized that kidnapping a caretaker to demand the phone number of a wealthy rabbi listed in the phone book in order to make a ransom demand made little sense, and the charge of kidnapping carried a sentence of 30 years to life, all to free a Black Panther they refused to cite by name. While DeFreeze was in jail, Temple B'nai Abraham was still receiving threatening phone calls about the incident. One anonymous caller chillingly stated, "Your caretaker, Whiters, identified the wrong man in court, and we want $10,000 or we'll blow up the temple." No bombing took place. It appeared to be a clumsy attempt to implicate the Jersey City Black Panthers and create the context for a reprisal by law enforcement. It occurred to me, County Prosecutor Hugh Francis told New York Magazine, that the FBI had engineered the whole thing. Putting aside for a moment the question of exactly which law enforcement organization DeFreeze was working for at the time, it is remarkable to have the county prosecutor openly telling the media that he suspects a case he's prosecuting is an FBI setup. Ralph Buddha Cobb was a respected officer of the Jersey City chapter of the Black Panther Party, considered important enough to the movement that coverage of his criminal case appeared in the Panthers' national newspaper, and the plot he was accused of enacting, kidnapping a rabbi's assistant to attain the phone number of a different rabbi, even though this rabbi's phone number was listed in the phone book, in a scheme to extort this other rabbi for money, all on behalf of some unnamed Black Panther called the Enforcer, who DeFreeze made sure to mention repeatedly, sounds like it was specifically engineered to make the Black Panthers look bad, without much thought put into its believability. All kidnapping-related charges against DeFreeze would be dropped, but Ralph Cobb took the case to trial and won acquittals on all counts. But in November of 1969, Donald DeFreeze would bungle a crime so badly that he risked exposing the LAPD's role in his crime spree. DeFreeze would rob a young tourist of her purse, battering her with the butt of a gun in the process. He may have escaped punishment for this initial robbery, but 2 days later, DeFreeze entered an LA bank, attempting to cash a check made out in his victim's name. When the teller became suspicious, DeFreeze ran, getting into a shootout with the bank security guard and police who had shown up in the meantime. DeFreeze was arrested on the scene, charged with 2 counts of assault to murder, plus first-degree robbery and possession of a fraudulent completed check. But the LAPD wouldn't be intervening to save him this time, according to Brad Schreiber in Revolution's End. The criminal conspiracy section of the LAPD, after the failed armed robbery at the Bank of America, was done arranging probation for DeFreeze. One of the main reasons was the .32 Beretta he used in that incident. DeFreeze fired upon the security guard and police with one of the stolen guns acquired among the 200 in the prior firearms case. For his cooperation, DeFreeze was allowed to keep some of them, for resale and, likely, to set up Panthers in future police agent activity. But now, with a gun potentially traceable to the LAPD, recovered after a bust, DeFreeze was jeopardizing the department. In late 1970, Donald DeFreeze was found guilty and sentenced to a then-legal indeterminate sentence of 5 years to life in the California Department of Corrections. It was California law at the time that all newly incarcerated prisoners should spend a short observation period, typically between 6 weeks and 90 days, at the California Medical Facility at Vacaville to determine what level of security the inmate should be housed in and whether or not he required medical or mental health treatment. But DeFreeze would end up spending 3 years at Vacaville, despite having no known serious medical or mental health diagnoses. Starting well before DeFreeze's arrival, the facility at Vacaville had been a site for CIA-funded psychological research, specifically Subproject 3 of a program known as MK Search, the successor program of MK Ultra. This fact was confirmed by the congressman and CIA critic Leo Ryan, who incidentally would die just a few years later in the infamous Jonestown cult massacre, in a 1978 letter he received from the deputy director of the CIA, Frank Carlucci. As described in Revolution's End, quote, Carlucci's letter to Leo Ryan acknowledged voluntary testing on prisoners at Vacaville with a drug called magnesium pemelin and claimed it had concluded in 1968. The letter, however, did not address other drugs or techniques that had been or were still used at the facility. Carlucci's carefully worded reply to Ryan merely stated that DeFreeze hadn't been involved in the pemelin experiments. Insofar as our reports reflect the names of the participants, there is nothing to indicate that DeFreeze was in any way involved in the project. While the precise experiments DeFreeze was subjected to remain unknown, the superintendent of Vacaville later admitted that DeFreeze, quote, volunteered for medical research at the prison, which, in the context of Vacaville, often just meant that the prisoner was coerced into signing a consent form as a means of escaping punishment for some infraction. Common treatments at Vacaville from the period included electroshock therapy, lobotomies, paralytic drugs like anectine, and so-called zombie drugs like Prolixin, which later investigators discovered had been administered to DeFreeze. But it seems clear that the most consequential part of DeFreeze's stay at Vacaville was the relationship he developed with an employee there who happened to be a CIA operative freshly back from helping run the Phoenix program in Vietnam. As detailed in Revolution's End, quote, Colston Richard Westbrook became Donald DeFreeze's early Vacaville confidant, sponsor, and supporter. Westbrook was an acerbic character who could only have existed in that time and place. He was black, pot-bellied, and wore dashikis and other African garb, and while he spoke 7 languages, including Swahili, he preferred to use black street language whenever possible. Westbrook served at Travis Air Force Base in Northern California, just miles from the town of Vacaville, and his facility with languages enabled him to travel all over the world in his military career. Westbrook was an advisor to the KCIA, the South Korean equivalent of the CIA. He also claimed to have had a direct line of communication in a past assignment to Cambodian Prime Minister Lon Nol, who replaced Prince Norodom Sihanouk in a coup orchestrated by the CIA. Between 1967 and 69, Westbrook was an advisor to the South Vietnamese Police Special Branch, under the cover of working as an employee of Pacific Architects and Engineers. Westbrook was in South Vietnam during the CIA's Phoenix program, during which 20,000 to 40,000 citizens, alleged Viet Cong sympathizers, were murdered over a 2-year period. Professor Peter Dale Scott wrote in the essay The Assassinations of the 1960s as Deep Events that Westbrook, after the destruction of the SLA, applied for a teaching job in Scott's English department at UC Berkeley. The chairman asked me to peruse Westbrook's curriculum vitae, and I immediately noticed that while in Vietnam, Westbrook had worked as a civilian employee of Pacific Architects and Engineers. PA&E was a well-known cover for the CIA in Saigon, and I so notified the chairman. Westbrook did not get the job. Among others who confirmed PA&E was a proprietary of the CIA was Bart Osborne of the Fifth Estate, a Washington, D.C. research group made up of former intelligence community members who changed their minds about the validity of the Vietnam War. Osborne himself was in charge of teams of men involved in the notorious Phoenix program. Pacific Architects and Engineers contracted the building of the interrogation torture centers known as Province Interrogation Centers in every one of South Vietnam's 44 provinces. These compounds were surrounded by high walls and gun towers and could communicate instantly with CIA headquarters in Saigon. The interrogation centers were staffed by South Vietnam's plainclothes secret police, the Special Branch, working in conjunction with South Vietnamese military intelligence officers and advised by undercover CIA liaison officers like Colston Westbrook, who used the cover of PA&E. The CIA's Phoenix program targeted only civilians, known as Viet Cong infrastructure, presumed to be sympathetic to the Viet Cong. VCI prisoners, like their American and South Vietnamese counterparts, experienced torture and deprivation, but these non-combatants had no form of redress and were not protected by the Geneva Conventions. Once accused, they were swept up and imprisoned without confirmation or any form of due process. Bart Osborne testified before Congress that all of the VCI suspects he dealt with in Vietnam died due to their mistreatment. When a VCI gave what was deemed actionable intelligence, a provincial reconnaissance unit was assigned to hunt down and kill the target. PRUs were a mixture of South Vietnamese and American military, mostly Navy SEAL teams, under the command of the CIA. 4 years after the Phoenix program was initiated, the New York Times, on July 15, 1971, revealed that 26,843 non-military Viet Cong insurgents and sympathizers had been neutralized in the previous 14-month period. The exact total of civilian injuries and deaths due to Phoenix will never be known. After Westbrook returned to the United States from Vietnam, William Herman, advising Governor Ronald Reagan on counterintelligence measures to combat leftist militancy, enlisted Westbrook to create and run the Black Cultural Association at Vacaville Medical Facility. The BCA was ostensibly an education program designed to instill black pride in Vacaville inmates. In reality, it became a cover for an experimental project to explore the extent to which unstable or susceptible prisoners could be controlled for the purpose of infiltration of Bay Area radical groups. Westbrook was euphemistically named an outside guest coordinator while in control of the BCA. His cover was as a teaching assistant at UC Berkeley's Afro-American Studies Department. His encouragement of black prisoners to talk about their experiences and identities, coupled with his outsized personality, helped him initially gain the trust of many inmates at Vacaville. Westbrook chose to befriend Donald DeFries, the former LAPD informant, in a prison where coercive treatment of prisoners was the norm. As Dr. Colin Ross noted in the CIA Doctors, there was a process by which DeFries later treated Patricia Hearst as a kidnap victim. It utilized isolation, psychological threats, physical abuse, and alleged dosing of Hearst with hallucinogenic drugs. All in all, it was a methodology that DeFries learned from his experience in Vacaville. Where did a street hood and unsuccessful robber like Donald DeFries learn such sophisticated programming techniques? My conclusion is that DeFries was a controlled controller, created in part by Phoenix program veteran Colston Westbrook. Schreiber identifies Westbrook's teaching assistant role at UC Berkeley as a CIA cover position, and although this can't be proven for obvious reasons, it was amusing to read Westbrook's quotes in newspaper stories about the SLA. Westbrook loved talking to the media, in which he gave the journalists a different job title in every interview he did. Sometimes he claimed to be an urban affairs instructor, at others he was a linguist or an instructor in black lexicon. Apparently, Westbrook had trouble keeping his cover story straight. Westbrook's role as an outside guest coordinator at first revolved around his handling of the prison's Black Cultural Association, an advocacy group for black prisoners at Vacaville, where inmates were encouraged to immerse themselves in the radical politics common in California prisons. There was a belief popular among students and radical left-wingers at the time that since African-American convicts, who the students naively referred to as political prisoners, were the primary victims of America's carceral state, they would be the ones most likely to lead the revolution against it. It was this strain of thought that elevated people like George Jackson, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, and Geronimo Pratt to positions of influence within the left-wing counterculture of the 60s and 70s. Westbrook would use his position on the UC Berkeley campus to recruit young white radicals to volunteer for the Black Cultural Association, inviting the true believers to interact with the supposed vanguard of their coming revolution. By all accounts, Donald DeFries was totally uninterested and uninformed when it came to politics, but in those BCA meetings, Westbrook would rapidly elevate DeFries to a position of authority that no other prisoner enjoyed. The DeFries faction in the BCA counted many future Symbionese Liberation Army militants as its members, people like Willie Wolfe, Russ Little, and Joe Ramiro. and Westbrook seemed to be positioning DeFries to have as much influence over these outsiders as possible. Westbrook was even the one who gave DeFries his nom de guerre, Sinkyu, which was a mispronunciation of the surname of Joseph Cinque, the African chief who had led the slave revolt on the ship Amistad. The word Symbionese was also a Westbrook invention, a neologism he had coined that was supposed to refer to the biological concept of symbiosis. The BCA charter required that its leader be chosen by election every 6 months, and since most of the inmates were transferred out in less than 3 months, the pool of eligible candidates was small. When DeFries put his name in the running and lost, Westbrook allowed him to create his own group, separate from the Black Cultural Association, called Unisight. Unisight had a vague mission statement that seemed to serve little purpose besides giving DeFries more free time with the outside radicals. In exchange for his cooperation, DeFries enjoyed privileges at Vacaville far beyond what any other inmate could expect. Fellow inmates told later investigators that the Vacaville guards chose DeFries as their designated marijuana dealer on the inside, smuggling in packages of weed for him to sell and split the profits 70-30. The guards also secretly gave DeFries unfettered access to the prison's conjugal visit trailers, usually reserved for married prisoners, so DeFries could enjoy occasional assignations with the radical women of the BCA and Unisight. 2 of those women, Nancy Ling Perry and Patricia Soltysik, would later become core members of the SLA. In fact, there was a 3rd woman who occasionally accompanied DeFries to the conjugal trailers, whose presence during this period completely destroys the conventional narrative of the Symbionese Liberation Army, according to Revolution's End. When Patty Hearst met future SLA member Patricia Soltysik in Berkeley and was invited to attend a women's rights meeting, her path toward meeting Donald DeFries at Vacaville was set. Famous private investigator Lake Headley's research revealed that 18-year-old heiress Patricia Hearst, daughter of Randolph Hearst, the publishing magnate, not only visited DeFries in 1972 at Vacaville, but also had romantic trysts with him in those conjugal trailers. One of Headley's affidavits, based on investigator Rusty Rhodes' interviews with numerous inmates, read in part, Patricia Campbell Hearst became involved with first the Black Cultural Association and then the Unisight Project sometime during 1972 at Vacaville, California. Patricia Campbell Hearst visited these prison projects under an assumed identity. Patricia Campbell Hearst developed a personal and political relationship at Vacaville Prison with Donald David DeFries, Sinkyu, while DeFries was the head of the Unisight Project, but still a prisoner. Hearst's fascination with radical politics in general, and the Black prisoner reform movement specifically, was shared by a fellow UC Berkeley student and future SLA member, Mary Alice Seams. Hearst, in an effort to avoid bringing infamy to her renowned family name, borrowed Seams's student identification card to visit DeFries at Vacaville. This was accomplished because Hearst and Seams were very similar in appearance, facially, in height, and in their slim physiques. Sharing Hearst's political views, Seams was committed to the movement, serving as a worker at a medical clinic for Venceremos in Redwood City, San Mateo County. She was also beneficiary of a $250,000 trust fund based on her family's holdings in the Northern California company Coggins Lumber. These encounters would continue even after DeFries was transferred to Soledad Prison in 1972, although Hearst would eventually end the relationship and get engaged to her boyfriend, a recent Princeton grad named Stephen Weed. Several Unisight members preceded DeFries to Soledad, and once there, DeFries quickly began making plans for their escape. One Unisight member and former crime partner of DeFries, named Fred Braswell, claimed that DeFries' escape was planned with the California Department of Corrections ahead of time. The most specific testimony about DeFries being allowed to escape Soledad came from Fred Braswell. He made the discovery by accident. I caught DeFries and Lieutenant James Nelson talking in the custody room one day, Braswell wrote, and that's when I was sure the CDC knew of our plans. They were discussing the SLA when Nelson saw me and ordered me into the recreation yard. DeFries told Nelson, no, let him stay. He knows everything. He's the second man. So then Nelson looked at me and told me I was going to escape. I didn't trust Nelson. I quietly started warning some of my people that the Department of Corrections knew our plans. Braswell, unlike DeFries, feared the expendability of a prisoner who worked clandestinely with the prison. He refused to cooperate, assuming that once they had done their duty, black SLA soldiers on the outside would be hunted down and killed, rather than rearrested and allowed the chance to publicize their incriminating knowledge. Private investigator Lake Headley spoke to a Soledad inmate who recounted he made an offer to help DeFries get a better work assignment. DeFries' reply was that in a few days, he was going to work in the boiler room of the South facility. This was peculiar. Those inmates employed in that section of the prison tended to be trusted by the administration because there were no guards or gun towers there. Prisoners did their work in South Facility and then were escorted back to the main line. DeFries was at Soledad less than 3 months, and his contentious history with the Black Cultural Association at Vacaville did not make him an ideal candidate for an unsupervised job. DeFries was asked by the same Soledad prisoner how he managed to get such an assignment when other convicts who had been at Soledad much longer had been turned down for it. He answered by merely giving a wide, enigmatic smile. True to his prediction, Donald DeFreeze was given the midnight to 8 a.m. shift at the boiler room in South Facility on March 5, 1973. Headley reported that a number of prisoners claimed that the South Facility was used at the time as a holding area for informers. After prison guard Jim Tucker accompanied DeFreeze, driving him in a pickup truck to South Facility, he left, returning the prisoner who had served the 4 p.m. to midnight shift. By the time Tucker returned, less than an hour later, DeFreeze was nowhere to be seen and could not be found. After Don split, Braswell remembered, I got my cue in June when I was ordered to minimum security at South Facility. I refused this offer because I knew we would all die. Several weeks later, I was in the recreation yard and a guard motioned for me to walk towards him. He was standing next to the gate and I started walking towards him. The guard opened the gate and walked away. I then turned around and walked back to the recreation yard. Because Braswell refused to be involved in the undercover counter-revolutionary black prisoner SLA, the California Department of Corrections moved to the next candidate, Damian Tomita. A year later, James Nelson called Tomita into his office, well aware of the money Tomita owed for the marijuana he smoked. He forced Tomita to agree to sell marijuana in the prison with the usual split, 30% to the convict and 70% to the prison. During this year, I was called into his office several more times, Tomita wrote, and Nelson tried to pressure me to sell harder drugs. However, since I had been in prison 8 years, and additionally because my brother had become a narcotics addict at a young age, I continually refused these requests. Incurring the wrath of Nelson led to Tomita's name being put on an execution list, as he termed it. I lived under perpetual fear of danger until late August 1973, when I was approached by Nelson in my cell. To my astonishment, instead of threats or further pressure, he told me, well, I have information that you're supposed to be leaving here soon. While I was still reacting to this first statement, he continued, yes, DeFreeze tells me that you're supposed to be leaving soon. DeFreeze had already escaped. These statements stunned me for a moment, and I asked him, what the hell is going on here? But the lieutenant only replied, you'll be notified when you're supposed to leave. You're supposed to be a new recruit of DeFreeze's. Either accept this or suffer the consequences here. Toward the end of the month, Tomita was approached by 2 guards, who informed him they were working with DeFreeze. Soon thereafter, one of the guards brought a dummy, which was placed as a decoy in Tomita's bunk. He was told to hide in a plumbing fixture in the prison yard, wait until dark, climb over the fence, and walk to the highway, where a car with 2 white men waited for him. They drove me to Berkeley, California, Tomita wrote, where a room was waiting for me. I was told that I would be contacted soon, and they left. The location of the room was a few blocks southwest of the university. On the outside, DeFreeze quickly moved in with one of his girlfriends from the Black Cultural Association, Patricia Soltysik, also known as Ms. Moon. Using the social network he'd built in the BCA and Unisite, DeFreeze began approaching other Bay Area radical groups with proposals for violent direct action that were as obvious of setups as the earlier rabbi kidnapping plot. According to Revolution's End, quote, Tim Finley, who wrote often on the SLA for the San Francisco Chronicle, filed a story that quoted many Berkeley community activists who met DeFreeze after he had escaped from Soledad. Finley noted that a number of these radical organizers had their suspicions about DeFreeze and included a quote from one person who said DeFreeze came on so heavy that he might be a provocateur. The public television station in San Francisco, KQED, ran a news report after the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, stating that a few leftist groups in the Bay Area were approached by DeFreeze shortly after he escaped from Soledad. DeFreeze startled them by offering his services as a hitman or contract killer. While late-night bombings of presumably unoccupied buildings, which represented oppression, had occurred with regularity years before via the Weather Underground and others, the idea of a radical hitman seemed incomprehensible to the groups that were approached. The KQED report said these activists suspected DeFreeze of being a police agent. The San Francisco Chronicle had even more detail about DeFreeze's outrageous offers to the radical left. It cited the fact that DeFreeze had reversed the process with some Bay Area activists. Instead of offering his services as a killer, he asked if any of the groups would agree to be paid for a contract killing. Now, it's at least possible to imagine that a newly escaped convict who spent years stewing in the violent rhetoric of prison radicalism and is desperate for money but unable to work because he just escaped prison, might actually dream up a scheme to make money by committing crimes for his newfound friends in the movement. But why would DeFreeze offer to become a hitman and then turn around days or weeks later and try to hire a hitman from among the middle-class college radicals of the Bay Area? And where would he get the money to do so? It's so patently absurd, so logically inconsistent, and so obviously intended to entrap the groups he approached. It sounds like something an out-of-touch right-wing cop or FBI agent would think up to entrap radical groups he didn't quite understand. The Weather Underground during this period was routinely bombing buildings related to the American war effort in Vietnam, but the weathermen took pains to ensure the buildings they targeted would be empty or nearly so to minimize casualties. This was as much a tactical decision as a moral one, as the weathermen understood that harming American citizens, even to oppose an unjust war, was bad propaganda. The SLA's tactic of targeting nonviolent individuals for arcane, ideologically vague reasons, on the other hand, seemed almost perfectly tailored to enrage average Americans. Even some of his closest associates in the SLA sometimes suspected that DeFreeze wasn't really the one in charge. Theodore Wheeler, a high-up member of the SLA, later told the San Francisco Chronicle, "I think he was being used by a lot of other people that felt certain things should be done, but they didn't have the nerve to do. And because he was an escaped convict and was mad, at the world and what was happening to him, that they used him." The original core of the SLA after DeFreeze got out of prison, however, were two of his girlfriends who had no such doubts. Nancy Ling Perry, described as the chief theoretician of the SLA, whose ideology would become the basis of the communiques the group would later send, and Patricia Soltysik, the woman who opened her home to DeFreeze after his escape. Willie Wolfe, Russ Little, and Joe Ramiro were other early joiners from the BCA days. The crime that would announce the Symbionese Liberation Army to the world was just as incomprehensible and ideologically backwards as the Hitman proposals. On November 6, 1973, the first black superintendent of the Oakland School District, 50-year-old Marcus Foster, was walking out of his school district's headquarters with his superintendent, 38-year-old Robert Blackburn, when they were accosted by two people who opened fire with a shotgun and two pistols. Blackburn was rushed to the hospital and survived. Foster wasn't so lucky. The next day, November 7, the SLA's first communique was found among mail delivered to the Berkeley radio station KPFA. The communique was read aloud on the radio and would soon be published by both the San Francisco Chronicle and the Oakland Tribune. According to Revolution's End, quote, "The charges against Marcus Foster were threefold, including the use in Oakland schools of a political police force, compiling of bio-dossiers through the Forced Youth Identification Program, and building of files for the Internal Warfare Identification Computer System." In fact, by using initial capitalization, the SLA suggested there was a specific computer system for identifying students. Nothing of the kind existed, and anyone who actually followed Oakland Unified School District activities and politics knew that Foster had taken bold steps to improve the status of non-white children, not deprive them of their privacy or other rights. Foster's discussion of security in the Oakland School District did not include weapons or police. In response to previous violent incidents on school grounds, Foster had created a $1 million plan for the integration of police, the juvenile court system, county probation, and parole departments, including peace officers and safety coordinators in selected schools, a truancy coordinator, and student ID card program. No one objected to it, either in the administration or in the community. It simply couldn't get sufficient funding. In October 1973, though, the California Council on Criminal Justice, about to provide $275,000 to the district, changed their previous agreement with Foster, saying in a revised draft of the new program that school security had to have a police background. Foster's staff checked the revised draft and missed the change. Just before the October 9 school board meeting, Foster caught the oversight, very upset. "He called me over and pointed it out," Blackburn remembered. He said, "Have you seen this? The most incredible thing." The community objected strongly at the school board meeting, having seen public mention of the change in the agenda. Foster explained what had happened and assured a concerned audience at the meeting that he did not and would not endorse the CCCJ provision on security with police backgrounds in schools. He even agreed to back away from an ID card proposal. Robert Blackburn said that the October 9 meeting was not any more raucous or emotional than most. Interestingly, Willie Wolfe was sent to the meeting to report back to the SLA. If Wolfe privately told DeFreeze of Foster's firm resolve at the meeting, no mention of it was ever made among the other SLA members. Many in the SLA later spoke as if Foster was about to create a school system not unlike apartheid South Africa. The assassination of Marcus Foster was somehow even more inconsistent with any kind of rational left-wing objectives than the rabbi kidnapping and the hitman discussions, if that's even possible. Foster was black, first of all, and a rather milquetoast mid-level bureaucrat, unobjectionable and generally popular among the largely black constituency of parents he served. But more importantly, the SLA's main charge against Foster, that he was instituting mandatory ID cards for students, wasn't even true. And moreover, they knew it wasn't true, because an SLA member had attended the very school board meeting where the issue of ID cards was decided. And the reasoning the SLA offered for the assassination in their first communique was similarly objectively false. After the shooting, the Pacific News Service reported, according to Bay Area journalists with connections on the left, and according to a group of activists who split from the SLA last fall, Foster had been marked for assassination by the SLA last summer, meaning the ID card allegations were likely a misdirection, as the SLA had settled on Foster as a target months before he raised the issue of security or ID cards in Oakland schools. The wider radical left reacted to the assassination of Marcus Foster with open suspicion and hostility towards the SLA. The editors in the respected journal of the 1970s New Left, Ramparts magazine, put into print what many radicals were privately saying to each other about the assassination. Namely, the act itself was so brutal, so morally unjustifiable, and so politically incomprehensible that most Bay Area radicals assumed the SLA to be a cover for some right-wing or police group. Even those who had previously considered themselves allies with or members of the SLA denounced them. A letter appeared in Berkeley's biggest underground newspaper, the Berkeley Barb, titled Ex-Symbionese Send Letter to the People, saying, "We are ex-members of the Symbionese Federation. We resigned collectively from the Federation immediately after the assassination of Dr. Marcus Foster. By resorting to abstract violence, the SLA not only separated itself from the rest of the revolutionary movement, but became the example to avoid, the stereotype of the mad terrorist, so indispensable to our oppressors to put us down even more with new laws and restrictions. We began to suspect that the War Council, meaning in reality DeFreeze, was manipulated either by some local right-wing organization or the CIA itself. The secret decision to kill Marcus Foster and its execution confirmed our suspicions." Even those in DeFreeze's inner circle didn't seem to understand the rationale for attacking Foster. SLA member Russ Little would later say, quote, "I remember saying to DeFreeze, why? Why would you kill a black guy? Jesus Christ, man, it's like there's black people being killed all over the place, man. You know, if you're going to kill somebody, why in the world would it be him?" It's a good question. Why would DeFreeze, who knew very little about politics, much less obscure local school board politics, choose Marcus Foster of all people as a target? What could possibly have been his motivation? Schreiber offers one explanation. Colston Westbrook had condemned Marcus Foster back when DeFreeze was attending the BCA in Vacaville. Westbrook even called him a fascist, a completely nonsensical charge, ignoring the white racism Foster diplomatically battled within the school district. A member of the BCA who was interviewed after the shooting said Westbrook was, quote, "always murder-mouthing about stopping Foster, screaming about his putting cops on campuses and giving identity cards to students. He should have known better. He knew how easy it was to get cons riled. Of course, maybe he wanted that." So Westbrook hadn't just chosen the names for DeFreeze and his new group, but he'd even picked their first victim. Westbrook had filled the bumbling, apolitical convict DeFreeze's head with outrageous slanders against a bureaucrat in the local education system of all people, and then set him loose with predictable results. But the next crime the SLA committed appears to have been DeFreeze's own idea. Convicts who had known DeFreeze at Vacaville and Soledad later told interviewers that he'd openly bragged about his relationship with Patty Hearst, but grew bitter and angry after she rejected him. Hearst was the granddaughter of the publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst, who had created the largest newspaper, magazine, newsreel, and film business in the world. She had grown up in affluence in San Francisco and was a college sophomore at the time of her abduction, actively, though secretly, engaged in the radical politics that dominated the UC Berkeley campus. By all accounts, DeFreeze had been kicking around the plan to kidnap Hearst since his time at Vacaville. Several members of the Vacaville BCA told private investigator Lake Headley that DeFreeze had discussed plans to abduct Patty Hearst and two of her sisters to hold for ransom. Headley even uncovered evidence that DeFreeze had pitched the idea of a fake kidnapping to Patty Hearst herself during their relationship as a way of extorting money from her wealthy family when DeFreeze got out of prison. Patty apparently rejected the plan, and her revulsion at the idea of extorting her own family was a primary factor leading to her breakup with DeFreeze. The kidnapping itself took place on February 4, 1974, when DeFreeze and two other SLA members forced their way into the apartment Hearst shared with her fiancé. Hearst would be bundled into their getaway car and transported to Daly City, south of San Francisco, where she would be kept blindfolded in the closet of a safe house. The next SLA communique reached KPFA in Berkeley 3 days later. The document didn't list any ransom demands, but contained a rambling manifesto claiming their intent to, quote, "destroy all forms and institutions of racism, sexism, ageism, capitalism, fascism, individualism, possessiveness, competitiveness, and all other forms of such institutions." Objectives so broad as to be almost meaningless. This manifesto debuted the SLA's seven-headed cobra symbol, where each head represented one of the 7 principles of the ostensible future Symbionese state. Unity, self-determination, creativity, purpose, and so on. 7 principles which Colston Westbrook had lifted from Kwanzaa, the faux African holiday invented by Ron Karenga and introduced to the Vacaville Black Cultural Association without attribution. The communique also contained an audio tape that, along with political messaging, contained a proof-of-life message spoken by Patty Hearst, which FBI analysts later concluded showed evidence of Hearst having been drugged, although no explicit ransom demands were made on the audio tape. In between rantings about U.S. foreign policy and promising that the SLA would abolish rent, DeFreeze demanded a, quote, good faith gesture from the Hearst family. $70 of free food should be distributed to each poor Californian over the next 4 weeks. Patty's father scrambled to meet the demands and set up distribution centers all over California, but the logistics were complicated, and several distribution sites descended into anarchy when demand exceeded supply. The accounts of Hearst's time in captivity vary greatly depending on who's describing them. The narratives agree that she was kept in a small closet in an SLA safe house for weeks, and blindfolded when in the presence of the SLA members to protect their identities. She was attended to primarily by Willie Wolfe, Nancy Ling Perry, and Angela Atwood, presumably to prevent her from recognizing Donald DeFreeze. Hearst's attorney in her criminal case would later claim the conditions resembled torture or brainwashing. She was placed in a closet on the floor. The closet was approximately 5 to 6 feet in length and about 2.5 to 3 feet in width. During all this time, she was in a constant state of fear and terror and expected at any moment to be murdered by her captors. When the blindfold was removed, she felt as if she were on an LSD trip. Everything appeared so distorted and terrible that she believed and feared that she was losing her sanity. Spending all his time in safe houses while being pursued by the FBI and local police, DeFreeze grew increasingly paranoid, at times demanding the TV be turned to face the wall because he believed the government could use it to spy on them. Patty Hearst's father would continue the food distribution scheme as the SLA released new audio tapes to KPFA, the only line of communication they had to the Hearst family. The Berkeley Barb published a letter to DeFreeze written by Colston Westbrook in which he seemed to be taunting DeFreeze over his secret informant work. "Did you tell her about the Unisite thing? Yes, do you remember the night when you asked me if you could have some time on my program so that you could do your Unisite thing? I gave it to you. The brothers didn't want to give you the time, but I did." Westbrook gave frequent media interviews about the SLA, and in one, he was asked if the behavior modification programs at Vacaville may have influenced the SLA's actions, responding, "At least the top leadership of the SLA has been trained in this process." The top leadership of the SLA was Donald DeFreeze. Notably, Westbrook didn't say he was subjected to behavior modification, but that he was trained in it. By the 13th day of her captivity, Patty Hearst was already extemporaneously reciting SLA ideology on the audio tapes released to the media. On April 3, 1974, just weeks after her kidnapping, a new SLA communique was played over KPFA radio, featuring Hearst declaring her name henceforth would be Tanya, the same nom de guerre as Tamara Bunk, the East German guerrilla who'd fought alongside Che Guevara in Bolivia, followed by criticisms of her parents and an announcement that she intended to, quote, stay and fight with the SLA. Hearst has maintained that she was induced to join them with threats of violence, but the other members who have commented on the issue publicly claim that the SLA intended to release her, and it was only after persistent lobbying from Hearst that the decision was made to allow her to stay. Ironically, one of the primary experts who would later be quoted in newspaper articles about the Hearst kidnapping was MK Ultra Dr. Louis Jolly West. Quote, "In circumstances of complete isolation, total dependence on a small group, and constant exposure to their feelings, it has been demonstrated again and again that people behave quite unlike what you would expect." Westbrook continued being sought for media interviews and frequently gave quotations implying he had special inside knowledge of the SLA. "I have a lot of information about them, both material and mental. I know many of them, know how they think and how they react." Patty Hearst's fiancé, Stephen Weed, would track Westbrook down and question him about his ties to the intelligence agencies. Weed said that when he asked Westbrook, he, quote, laughed at the idea of his alleged CIA-FBI connections, but didn't deny them. Westbrook said, "Not even my old lady knows everything about my background." The SLA was quickly running out of money, and by this time they had already downsized from a large apartment in a nice neighborhood near the ocean to a 3-bedroom economy in a ghetto area just blocks from the San Francisco FBI building. On April 15th, less than 2 weeks after Hearst had officially joined the SLA, she would wield a sawed-off M1 carbine in the robbery of the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco's Sunset District, the first in a series of serious felonies she would commit during her time in the SLA. When 2 elderly customers obliviously walked into the bank in the middle of the holdup, Nancy Ling Perry panicked and opened fire, wounding both of them. They would be the only injuries in the robbery, which netted the SLA a little over $10,000, equivalent to about $72,000 today. Patty Hearst's defenders in the media insisted that she must have participated in the robbery under duress, and when the bank's surveillance tape was released, some argued that DeFreeze's gun appeared to have been pointed in Hearst's direction the whole time. But when an FBI agent took the tape to be analyzed by lip readers, he was told that Hearst had said, "I'm Tanya, up against the wall, mother." Elements of the New Left media ecosystem kept up their skeptical coverage of the SLA, often scooping the mainstream media. A task force was set up to investigate the SLA by the left-wing screenwriter and journalist Donald Freed, called the Citizens Research and Investigation Committee. A private investigator they employed, Lake Headley, interviewed LAPD Sergeant R.G. Farwell on tape and extracted perhaps the clearest evidence yet of DeFreeze's informant background. Toward the end of the interview, Headley talked about a letter DeFreeze had written in 1970 to a judge overseeing a criminal case against him, in which DeFreeze made extended, sometimes rambling references to his newfound religious beliefs. Sergeant Farwell replied, "Well, that's why I cut him loose. He was getting into that, and I knew he was unstable as far as psychological things are concerned." Farwell admitted that he had used DeFreeze for informant work, but maintained that he had stopped doing so in 1970 because DeFreeze was becoming psychologically unbalanced. Perhaps realizing the gravity of the admission, Farwell cut the interview short, saying, "Okay, right now I'm going to stand where I am. I don't mind talking to you, but the guy, DeFreeze, is in trouble, and if word gets out that he did anything at all for the police, he's dead." Just weeks later, on May 7, one of Headley's private investigators discovered that numerous files regarding Donald DeFreeze were lost at the LA County Clerk's office, including his probation reports, letters from DeFreeze's wife, and even DeFreeze's 1970 letter to the judge, which had supposedly convinced Farwell of his mental illness. Headley's research also revealed that DeFreeze had been working not only for Sergeant Farwell at the Criminal Conspiracy Section of the LAPD, but also for the California state equivalent of the FBI, the Criminal Investigation and Identification Unit, also known as the CII. The Los Angeles area arrest record of DeFreeze lists him as CII case number 277-1103. His affiliation with the CII explains why DeFreeze's informant activities stretched from the San Francisco Bay Area all the way to the state of New Jersey. The admission from Sergeant Farwell prompted an investigation by the San Francisco Chronicle, which reported that DeFreeze had been a highly protected and valued informant for the LAPD from 1967 to 69, and that he continued to be a snitch in Vacaville and Soledad. The newspaper contacted Sergeant Farwell, who only said that his superiors ordered him to say nothing more about the subject to anyone. Facing new media pressure, LA Police Chief Ed Davis admitted that DeFreeze had once turned in a partner to police, presumably a reference to the 200-gun theft case, an admission he couldn't avoid because DeFreeze had used one of the guns to fire on police. But Davis then suggested the LAPD had a longer history with him, saying DeFreeze, quote, proved himself to be a cheap, undependable turnover punk. Evel Younger, the Attorney General of California under then-Governor Ronald Reagan, released a calculated statement pretending to address the issue. Quote, "At no time during my tenure has Donald DeFreeze been an informant for the Attorney General's office." No one had suggested DeFreeze worked directly for the Attorney General's office. In yet another of his many media interviews, Colston Westbrook made a similar admission. "I'm not an informer, but I am an informant. I collect information from a lot of people and sift it and pass it on. I've given it to both the FBI and the SLA." By this time, SLA members Russ Little and Joe Ramiro had been arrested while in possession of the guns used to shoot Marcus Foster, and were facing charges for his murder. Surviving SLA members have unanimously claimed that the real shooters were the original core group of the SLA, Nancy Ling Perry and Patricia Soltysik, with help from DeFreeze. But Little and Ramiro were still loyal to the SLA at the time and refused to snitch on their comrades. Interviewed after the revelations about DeFreeze's informant work, Russ Little appeared to reevaluate some of DeFreeze's actions in light of this new knowledge. DeFreeze made mention of some psychological warfare against the police. It was like trying to fake the police out, but it seemed like he totally lost track of that. Are you doing this for the police? Is the communique for the police, or is it to try to explain to people what you're doing? I mean, who is it for? Increasingly desperate and paranoid, the group split up and fled San Francisco for LA, turning to theft to provide their basic needs. While stealing clothes from a sporting goods store, Bill and Emily Harris were confronted by security, who were trying to detain the couple when, from across the street, Patty Hearst opened fire with an M1 rifle, allowing the Harrises to escape. They would ditch the getaway car, and Hearst and Emily Harris wound up carjacking and kidnapping a series of drivers to escape the area. While the San Francisco underground had been largely willing to shelter and protect members of the SLA, Los Angeles proved less accommodating. The rest of the SLA, Nancy Ling Perry, Camilla Hall, Angela Atwood, Patricia Soltysik, Willie Wolfe, and Donald DeFreeze had resorted to bribing a woman renting a house in South Central LA to let them hide there. Within days of their arrival, the mother of the woman sheltering the SLA made an anonymous call to the LAPD, informing them of the group's location. The house was quickly surrounded by the LAPD and the FBI, who made almost 30 surrender announcements to the SLA in the coming hours. When the LAPD SWAT team began launching tear gas canisters into an open window, the SLA opened fire with automatic weapons, starting the biggest firefight in LAPD history up to that point. Less than an hour later, thick smoke began billowing out of the house, followed by fire. Within 2 hours, every SLA member in the house would be dead. Despite having fired multiple pyrotechnic gas grenades into the house during the shootout, the LAPD would rule the cause of the fire as undetermined. Nancy Ling Perry's body was found about 10 feet away from the back of the building, unarmed and shot in the back, suggesting she had been fired upon while trying to surrender. The rest had died in the fire or from gunshot wounds. There was no effort made to fight the fire, even as it grew and spread to surrounding buildings. Fire trucks had arrived on scene, but were blocked from the street by the LAPD. In Westbrook's last major newspaper interview about the SLA, he told the interviewer that he believed Donald DeFreeze had just been following orders, and that the true leader of the SLA was still at large. When the journalist asked who the real leader of the SLA was, Westbrook replied, "You really want to get me in trouble, huh?" She asked him if it was someone known to the public. "Yes, at the right time you expose your hand. There's a theory that I'm number one, because I haven't been killed yet." Westbrook continued, "How would you like to join the CIA? You'd be a natural." As the interview wound down, Westbrook asked the journalist what she would do if she found the true leader of the SLA. "Would you tell me?" Westbrook asked. When the journalist answered in the negative, Westbrook leaned in and whispered, "How do you know I don't already know?" The remaining SLA members, Bill and Emily Harris and Patty Hearst, would go underground, traveling to the East Coast and recruiting new members. In April of 1975, during a robbery of a Crocker National Bank branch in Carmichael, California, Emily Harris would accidentally fire her shotgun at a bank customer, Myrna Opsahl, who didn't survive her wounds. In September of 1975, Bill and Emily Harris would be arrested by the FBI while jogging near their apartment in San Francisco. The same day, Patty Hearst and Wendy Yoshimura were arrested in an apartment in the Outer Mission District. The remaining SLA members would disappear into the underground, with some evading arrest for almost 30 years. 6 years before Patty Hearst's first trial, the state of California had successfully prosecuted Charles Manson for a series of murders he had not personally committed and wasn't even present for, by arguing that Manson had used brainwashing and mind control techniques to coerce his family to kill. Patty Hearst's defense lawyers in the Hibernia bank robbery case sought to use the same argument in reverse, that she had been brainwashed and therefore had a diminished capacity to control her own actions. Hearst's wealthy parents funded an elaborate defense in which the famous psychologists Margaret Singer and Robert J. Lifton testified about her mental state. Singer claimed that she'd been transformed into a low IQ, low affect zombie, while Lifton diagnosed her as a classic case of coercive persuasion and thought reform, which met the criteria of a coerced prisoner of war. MKUltra Dr. Louis Jolly West volunteered his services to the Hearst family for free, and testified that the treatment Hearst had been subjected to was a classic example of coercive persuasion. West claimed Hearst was suffering from a traumatic neurosis and that her IQ had been reduced by 20 points since the time of her kidnapping. West testified that after firing her M1 rifle outside the sporting goods store, Hearst's first words to Bill and Emily Harris were, "Did I do it right?" She was like a child performing for her parents, West said. He claimed that Hearst, then 22 years old, had suffered from personality regression to childishness and a childlike dependence upon her captors, especially Donald DeFreeze. The prosecution questioned West's motives, pointing out that Patty Hearst's mother was on the Board of Regents for the University of California system, and West was employed by UCLA, suggesting that he may have had a conflict of interest. West's reply is intriguing in light of his MKUltra work. "When I came to UCLA in 1969, my department had $1 million in research funds from the state of California. We now have $12 million in research funds, none of which comes from the state. I don't have to look to the regents for research funds." West was admitting that his arrival at UCLA coincided with a massive increase in federal funding for his department, which raises interesting questions given his CIA-funded research on brainwashing and his alleged ties to Haight-Ashbury and the Charles Manson case. When Hearst was arrested, she signaled her loyalty to the SLA by listing her occupation on jail intake forms as urban guerrilla, but within weeks, she had repudiated her former comrades. Her previous association with DeFreeze and the BCA wasn't discovered before trial, but the prosecution would nevertheless depict her as a rebellious and eager participant in the SLA, while her defense relied on a theory of reduced capacity through brainwashing, which wasn't a recognized legal defense. Ultimately, Hearst would be found guilty and sentenced to 7 years for the Hibernia bank robbery, then given probation for the sporting goods store shooting. After just 22 months of her sentence, some of which was spent on bail pending appeal, President Jimmy Carter commuted her federal sentence on the Hibernia robbery, and she walked out of prison with only her state probation remaining. So if the SLA had been an op, then who was in control if it wasn't DeFreeze? Well, Lake Headley and the Citizens Research and Investigation Committee uncovered documentary evidence proving that DeFreeze had been an informant for the LAPD under the Criminal Investigation and Identification Unit and the Criminal Conspiracy Section, which the department chief and DeFreeze's handler both admitted in media statements. This could, at the very least, explain DeFreeze's early informant work and the New Jersey Black Panther entrapment plot. But there are other possibilities. In 1971, just a few years before the formation of the SLA, an informant for the Criminal Conspiracy and Special Investigation sections of the LAPD, named Louis Tackwood, went public with allegations that the LAPD had coordinated with the FBI to create a special political intelligence unit called Squad 19 that specialized in false flag, agent provocateur, and other subversion operations targeting the political left. Tackwood maintained that in his role as an informant, he'd been induced to call in fake anonymous tips to the LAPD, one of which resulted in a police raid of a black Muslim mosque in LA. According to Tackwood, the LAPD had funneled money and guns to Ron Karenga's U.S. org with the understanding that they would be used in violent confrontations with the Black Panthers, identical to the FBI plots which would later be revealed with the release of classified COINTELPRO files. Tackwood said he'd been sent undercover in a joint CIA-FBI operation to infiltrate black militant groups and spy on Berkeley City Council candidates. He further claimed to have been involved in an abortive Squad 19 plot to provoke violence and possibly even plant explosives at the 1972 Republican National Convention in San Diego as a false flag operation to provide the pretense for a national crackdown on radical groups. Tackwood had convinced members of the underground press of his credibility by allowing them to record his phone calls with his LAPD handlers in which they discussed their prior operations together, but the mainstream media never picked up the story. Could DeFries have been intended as an agent provocateur to entrap Berkeley radicals? An arrangement like this could explain DeFries' bizarre hitman plots, where he both offered his services for and tried to solicit contract killings. As for DeFries' time in Vacaville, the deputy director of the CIA, Frank Carlucci, admitted that Vacaville had been the location of MK search research prior to DeFries' arrival there. However, the prison had continued its medical experimentation, behavior modification, forced medication, and thought control techniques well into DeFries' incarceration there. Obviously, this is pure speculation, but it's entirely plausible that the CIA had continued conducting MKUltra-like research in Vacaville under some other program name. The existence of MKUltra wasn't revealed to the public until the summer of 1975 with the release of Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission reports, so any behavior modification experiments during DeFries' Vacaville stay wouldn't have faced the kinds of suspicion and scrutiny that existed after 1975. The presence of Colston Westbrook, a known CIA operative and admitted FBI informant, at this prison, which had ostensibly just ended its MKUltra experiments a couple years earlier, is suspicious to say the least. The entire pretense of Westbrook's role at the prison was that he was a UC Berkeley professor, altruistically facilitating interactions between college students and black convicts. But when asked what subject he actually taught at Berkeley, Westbrook seemed to name a different discipline every time, suggesting his university placement may have been a cover story. And Westbrook was just back stateside from having helped run the Phoenix program in Vietnam, which was a counterintelligence and interrogation operation aimed at extracting intelligence from suspected Viet Cong collaborators. It's not hard to imagine why the CIA or the FBI would want to implant someone with interrogation and infiltration experience into the Bay Area prisons, where political radicalism seemed to be taking over. Westbrook admitted that the leadership of the SLA, meaning DeFries, was trained in the process of behavior modification, which casts his later treatment of Patty Hearst, the blindfold, the sleep deprivation, the druggings, and forced propaganda recitations, in a much different light. It's difficult to overlook the sheer magnitude of Westbrook's influence on the Symbionese Liberation Army. He thought up their name, or at least the Symbionese part. He gave Donald Cinque DeFries his mispronounced nom de guerre. He introduced the seven-headed cobra symbol and the 7 principles he pilfered from Kwanzaa that gave the symbol its meaning. He introduced DeFries to Willie Wolfe and the other white radicals that became the SLA, even letting them create a private group when DeFries failed to take over the Black Cultural Association. He even gave the SLA a victim to vent their rage at by murder-mouthing Marcus Foster in front of the then apolitical DeFries. It's hard to see how the SLA could have happened, or at least happened the way it did, without the influence of the CIA operative Colston Westbrook. Another possible vector of federal involvement was the FBI's PRISACS, or Prison Activist Surveillance Program, a branch in the COINTELPRO family of operations specifically targeted at prison-based radical activism. Although it officially launched in 1974, the program that became PRISACS existed at least as early as 1970 under different names. PRISACS created a liaison program through which the FBI would establish ongoing contacts with key people in prisons throughout the country. They organized a symposium at FBI headquarters called the National Symposium on Prisons as a Revolutionary Target, where the FBI would teach the tactics of counter-revolutionary warfare to prison bureaucrats from across the U.S., while they networked with administrators from the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration and the CIA. At the 1973 symposium specifically, the prison administrators were taught to think about their work as a domestic war, and then trained by people who had engaged in counterinsurgency warfare throughout the world. Counterinsurgency warfare like the Phoenix program. The operation that became PRISX started as a classification in FBI files called Black Extremist Activity in Penal Institutions, an appellation that showed up on the FBI files of the Black Liberation Army, the Black Guerrilla Family, Geronimo Pratt, George Jackson, and eventually the SLA. As for the intelligence motive in creating a group like the SLA, it's worth noting that the Black Panther Party was notoriously difficult to infiltrate because membership relied on a personal word-of-mouth and vouching system where admission was limited to Black people who had demonstrable social ties to a specific neighborhood or to someone already in the Panthers, hence why the LAPD was resorting to having people like Louis Tackwood call in fake tips against them. The few informants the government was able to cultivate were mostly long-standing members who were induced to provide information to get out of criminal charges. But the Panthers were generally extremely paranoid about informants and dealt with more than one snitch with extreme violence, up to and including murder. Perhaps the government thought it would be easier to entrap black radicals in more serious charges if they were approached by peers like DeFreeze, with the credibility of having served time or committed violent acts for the cause. Louis Tackwood, the informant who revealed the existence of Squad 19, said that in exchange for his CIA and FBI informant work, he was given a license to steal. In other words, the police gave him leeway to commit crimes below a certain threshold, so long as he remained an informant. Maybe DeFreeze started out with a similar arrangement, hence the numerous firearm arrests for which he walked away with probation, but then at some point, he started to believe his own hype as the General Field Marshal Sinkyu, and burned the handlers who were protecting him. It is notable that the only arrest who actually earned DeFreeze prison time was the one in which he used an illegal gun the police had already confiscated from him once, suggesting DeFreeze had a similar license to commit crime until it jeopardized the LAPD's plausible deniability regarding his informant work. By all accounts, Donald DeFreeze was politically ignorant and apathetic upon his arrival at Vacaville, and during his time leading the SLA, he left the actual political theorizing to Nancy Ling Perry and Bill Harris. Even after becoming the ostensible head of his own political terrorist group, DeFreeze still occasionally called it the Symbionese Liberation Army, and his strategizing seemed to flow backwards compared to a typical guerrilla faction leader. Rather than becoming so outraged over Marcus Foster's policies that he felt violence was the only answer, DeFreeze appears to have decided on violence first, and then Colston Westbrook just sort of aimed DeFreeze in the direction of Foster. And what's more, their whole justification for targeting Foster in the first place appears to have been a cover story, since they already knew that Foster's alleged crimes against the people, the ID card and school police policies, had been canceled well before his assassination. The mainstream media seemed to accept Patty Hearst's kidnapping at face value, when the whole ordeal was fraught with contradictions. How did the SLA find Hearst's apartment in the first place if they were strangers? Why did it take weeks for the SLA to release their ransom demands, even though that was ostensibly the whole point of the kidnapping? Why kidnap Randolph Hearst's daughter instead of Randolph himself? The underground press and the Citizens Research and Investigation Committee recognized the absurdity of the situation immediately, but predictably, the mainstream media coordinated to portray the wealthy Patricia Hearst as favorably as possible. The true history of the SLA has been obscured in a maze of classified programs, prison snitches, intelligence operatives, and agents provocateurs, so parsing reality from rumor and misdirection is a difficult task. The SLA latched onto the nascent radical movement of the 1970s and cartoonishly embodied its most irrational and destructive aspects, mimicking their lingo and aesthetics while pushing a political program that sounded incoherent and vague to outsiders. If DeFreeze's handler's objective was to make the radical left seem deranged and violent to normal Americans, they couldn't have done a much better job.
For those people who still believe that I'm brainwashed or dead, I see no reason to further defend my position. I am a soldier in the People's Army. Patria o muerte, venceremos.
Death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people.